This is the Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski.
With former prosecutor and guest Laurie Gilbertson.
Former Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke really had created an atmosphere where victims or sex workers didn't feel very safe coming forward, considering his own involvement in the industry. People like this, like Heuerman and sex workers and all that, they don't live in a bubble. This goes on all over the country. There's likely far more Rex Heuermann type characters out there, if in fact he's guilty of this. If you have that sort of atmosphere where the police won't listen, most people want to stay away from such a icky topic, if you will. What does one do who has knowledge of crimes like this? Because in clearly this case, there were people who had Heuermann's description down to a T, and they gave it away 10 years ago, but nothing was done.
Yeah, it's pretty disheartening and horrifying and sad, and just so many, emotions you can think of when you hear this kind of thing and you think of what could have happened had gotten attention 10 years ago. And it's, like you said, it's not unusual. I mean, how many, Law and Orders have there been about this exact thing?
Yeah.
Really? How many, crime shows cover this where, of course, the prostitutes are not getting any kind of response from the police because of who they are, and they're not believed, and they're not taken seriously, and they're not considered to be victims. And I say that almost with kind of quotes around it, victims in the way that people think of victims. And what can you do? I mean, there are lots of things that can be done within law enforcement to change that. And when I was working as a prosecutor in New York, we had the Special Victims Bureau. We had an entire bureau that was really devoted to women, men, children who had been victims of any kind of sex crime. And it did not matter, of course, who they were, what their background was, what was going on, in terms of any kind of, prostitution or drug deals or illegal activity when they were victimized and when they really suffered from people who were victimizing them specifically because of their position. And what you do is you develop a different mentality and a different mindset, starting with investigators who respond to the crime, starting with the beat cop who's out there, who doesn't just dismiss it because, this is just, a hooker and a client, starting right from the ground up, starting with education. And it goes from every single, beat police officer all the way up the chain of command, so that you don't have people like the law enforcement officer, and I kind of say that with quotes around it, who was handling this and did not give them what the victims the kind of justice or accountability for the crimes against them that were going on. And so you need to really develop a totally different climate of ways of looking at these things. And things are so ingrained that can be tough, but it can absolutely be done. And I worked in it, and I saw it done in New York, and I saw a complete way of really treating victims with the respect that they deserved. It made a huge difference in the kind of crimes that we were able to prosecute, and in victims being willing to testify.
Sure. And and that's a big thing, is getting them willing to testify and wanting to testify without fear of repercussion of going back into that world or going back into their life and what could possibly happen to them. So many of them got into this. It's an astonishing number. It's like 90-some% that get into this not by choice. It's trafficking. It's being forced. It's not some promiscuous woman who one day said, I'm going to be a hooker. That's not how that works. So go ahead.
Yeah. No, go on, please.
So you have all of these people who are in this place that did not want to be there to begin with. A lot of them, it's all they know, because sometimes the trafficking starts at such a young age and the abuse starts at such a young age. And then, you have all of the mental disorders that come along with that sort of a life that you've been pushed into. Is it not a direction where, if it were looked into deeper and further and not just skimming the surface of, this is a hooker and this is the John. Yeah, where's the pimp? And then who does he work for? Who's beyond that? And who's beyond that? Does that not dig down into that trove of trafficking and start to really get at essentially the queen bees of some of these trafficking rings, if it were to be dug into deeper rather than just being dealt with on the surface with the sex workers and the pimps and such?
Oh, absolutely. And there is a trend to certainly be doing that and to certainly be launching those kind of investigations. And, maybe at some point, the deeper this gets, and it is difficult, but, we see a lot of RICO being used in lots of ways. The Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. And what it really had been used for was organized crime.
Yeah.
And we see it being used for all kinds of crime. We see it in the national news. We've seen it in federal courts, in state courts, really having this incredibly wide reach to prosecute conspiracies among many people. So that may be one way to really start to get to the heads of these organizations that go so much further than, as you said, women who may be trafficked, women who may have been falling into these situations where drugs are almost always involved, where abuse as a child and then further into life that drive them into this is almost always involved. And what I can say is that the heads of those organizations, the trafficking, all of it, they choose their victims and they choose them well. And they choose the people who are very susceptible to this kind of coercion. And Rex Heuermann and the Rex Heuermanns of this world chose their victims well as also. He no doubt knew by targeting these women that mostly they were not going to be missed, not all of them, because of where they were in their life. Mostly police and law enforcement, as we've even seen, were not going to pay a whole lot of attention to these crimes. Mm-hmm. And mostly he was going to get away with it for a really long time because he chose them for exactly the same reasons that you were just stating, that they eventually ended up in this position. And, no matter why they ended up in this line of work, even if it was, as you said, a promiscuous woman who decided to do this, no one, absolutely no one deserves, what happened to them or any kind of violence, of course. And so, as you were saying, we just look at this whole thing holistically, and there's so much, have been some things done, but so much more to be done, because you are talking about people who are going to be so frightened from their history of law enforcement that we've seen specifically, even in this case, to really cooperate and go forward. It's hard enough. Think about, Tony, I had, an experience where I was robbed on the street in New York City. Yeah. And it was hard enough for me to kind of figure out which precinct do I go to and who do I call? And then when do I have to go to court? And I worked in that industry.
Yeah, exactly.
So it can be very scary, especially when, as you've said, they're not being treated in a way that many other victims are treated.
You're consuming the Hidden Killers podcast.
Want more? Start binging on all of our true crime podcasts right now through Apple Podcasts and get an ad-free experience when you sign up to be a True Crime Today Premium Plus member exclusively on Apple Podcasts.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast dropping soon.
Press subscribe now.